Thank you for attending our first event in the 2021 Sentencing Workshop Series titled Justice Counts, Using Data to Inform Policy and Bolster Public Safety, hosted by the National Association of Sentencing Commissions and the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. Before we begin, we have just a few notes we'd like to share with you. First, to streamline the appearance of the event today, we suggest that you hide non-video participants. To do that, click on the three dots at the top right corner of any participant box that has their video off and click Hide Non-Video Participants. Second, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation. Third, please note that auto-generated transcription has been enabled for this event. To change how you view the automated transcription or to hide it, click Live Transcript in the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the event page and social media channels as soon as possible after the event. Follow us at OSU Law DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the event. Bennett?
Thank you. Good afternoon to some, good morning to others. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Drug Enforcement Policy Center at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and the National Association of Sentencing Commissions. This is the second year of collaboration between these two entities, and I'm excited for this continuing series of webinars, including today's on Justice Counts. I'm pleased to be a National Steering Committee member for Justice Counts and also serve on the court subcommittee. What I'm really excited about, however, is to have the perspective of sentencing commissions to weigh in on the importance of sentencing data. That will be a crucial piece of this project. Justice Counts represents a significant opportunity to advance the field of data and information. This collaborative effort will help to identify key metrics used to inform budget and policy decisions, and to help empower agency and leaders to collect, analyze, report, and utilize data from across the entire criminal justice system. Justice Counts is not a mandate, however, but it is an opportunity to help mobilize states to take action and improve our respective data efforts. After hearing about what exactly Justice Counts is, we will hear from some of our NASC colleagues in Kansas and Oregon to learn more about their data dashboards. These states have done great work to visualize their data and information, and I'm sure we'll all be very interested to see what they have to say. Right now, I'd like to turn this over to Sarah Lee and Megan Grasso from the CSG Justice Center to tell us more about this project.
Thank you, Bennett. As you mentioned, my name is Sarah Lee. I'm a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments, and I'm presenting with Megan Grasso, our Deputy Program Director. I'm not sure who's moderating right now, but if we could put the slides up, thank you so much, that would be wonderful. As I mentioned, we are working on the Justice Counts project, and we are so excited to be presenting with you here today. Let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what is Justice Counts? Why are we here? We're here because safety and justice deserve better data. Now, if you're listening to me as a policymaker in the criminal justice field, you probably agree that you rely on data that is up to date and accessible to make informed decisions. But frequently that data isn't up to date or it isn't accessible, and we are working to change that. Justice Counts is an unprecedented coalition of state and local leaders. And let's talk about who those leaders are. Can we go to the next slide, please? Justice Counts is a BJA-funded program based on a 2019 solicitation under the heading Data-Led Governing. We assembled a coalition of 21 organizations to be a part of this project. These are organizations from across the criminal justice field. Can we go to the next slide? They represent state and local leaders, national professional associations, technical assistance and technology providers, and others, all of whom are dedicated to this mission of making criminal justice data more accessible and more usable for policymakers across the criminal justice field. Next slide. Thank you. So let's talk about where we are in the Justice Counts project. Right now, we're at the beginning of the project in phase 1, and phase 1 has two main components. The first component is what we're calling our state data component. And the goal here is to create a national inventory of criminal justice data that will live on the Justice Count's website. This will be aggregate level data across all 50 states, and we're hoping to make the first round of data available to the public coming up in June. We're very excited about that. This will be data around correctional populations, and then jails and law enforcement data will follow as well. And Megan will discuss that a little bit more detail in a minute. In addition to the state data component, we're also developing criminal justice metrics that Bennett alluded to before. Those metrics are going to be developed by 7 issue-specific subcommittees that we have just finished assembling. Those 7 specific issues will be law enforcement, jails, courts and pretrial operations, defense, prosecution, prisons, and community supervision. And NASC is going to be represented, as Bennett mentioned, not only on our National Steering Committee, but on our Courts and Pretrial Operations Subcommittee. Each subcommittee is going to be composed of 8 to 10 individuals with a range of experiences and backgrounds across the criminal justice system with issue-specific expertise. They're going to be meeting for the first time over the next couple of weeks to develop these metrics, and the metrics will then be honed and by our National Steering Committee. The metrics are designed to enhance policymakers' understanding of their jurisdiction's criminal justice system and facilitate data-driven policy and budgetary decision-making. Once those metrics have been developed, we're hoping towards the end of this year through a series of subcommittee meetings and meetings of our National Steering Committee, we'll be moving to phase 2 of the project at the end of this year, hopefully. Phase 2 will be the development of resources for governments. We're thinking about online self-assessment tools, in addition to publications by our project partners aimed at stakeholders throughout the criminal justice field. Those will be based on the metrics developed in phase 1. Once we've developed those tools in phase 2, we'll be moving to phase 3, hopefully at the beginning of next year. And phase 3 will be our national campaign to implement those metrics across the country. We'll be working with jurisdictions to provide technical assistance to allow them to adopt those metrics. As Bennett mentioned, they're not mandatory, but we're hoping to the adoption, the way that the metrics were developed, will encourage states across the country to adopt those metrics. Now I'm going to turn it over to Megan to talk a little bit more about the specific work that we're doing right now in phase 1.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide, please. So as Sarah mentioned, one of the first things we're doing with Justice Counts is the State Data Hub, and we're really excited about it. All too often, what we've seen is criminal justice data is scattered across agencies, submerged deep in reports, and all too often it comes out and the data is kind of stale by the time it's released. And so we're trying to solve for that through this state data component, where we're going to be working with our technology partner Recidiviz to gather data from different parts of the criminal justice system and put it all in one place. And so we're starting off, thanks. We're starting off with corrections data. And this is still very much in draft, so this is not complete yet. But in this example, we're taking a look at Alabama's data. And I know it's probably hard to see on your screen, but I'll just walk you through it. So at the start of the page for Alabama's data, we're taking a look at some key insights. And so that will show the prison population current numbers and how that's changed over the past year, as well as probation and parole revocations. And we pointed those numbers out because we think that they're really important for policymakers to have an understanding of what's going on in their prison system. They spend a lot of money, a lot of people are incarcerated there. And then what we've seen in our justice reinvestment and confined and costly and other work is that all too often people who are on probation and parole and are revoked from supervision to prison account for a significant portion of prison admissions, populations, costs. And so want policymakers to see those headline numbers at the start. The text in black will show the latest population number, and then the text in blue will show how that has changed over the past year. Once going from the key insights, then you'll be able to see the system flow, how people are moving through the prison system. So how many people enter probation, their population, and how many are revoked to prison, how many people are coming into prison for a new commitment, what that population looks like, and releases, as well as parole populations and revocations. And then after taking a look at the system flow, one would be able to see, dig a little bit deeper and see these line charts that show the probation population, how that's changed over time, and then looking into admissions, seeing total prison admissions, new court offenses, new court commitments, pardon me, and probation and parole revocations. And then one could dive in a little bit deeper into the revocations. And if the data is available for new crime or technical violation, that data would be shown as well. In this example, I can't tell you if it's because Alabama doesn't have that data or if it's something that we just haven't collected yet, since it's still a work in progress. But we thought it was important to show not just what data is available, but also potential data that isn't currently being made publicly available. A lot of these are basic data points that one agency or another typically has on hand. And so we wanted to be able to show that. And so in this example, the data comes from different Alabama agencies, from the Department of Corrections, as well as the Board of Pardons and Paroles. In addition to having the data, there's little icons that one could click on to see what the data sources are, because we want to have transparency and have folks understand where the data came from. Next slide, please. And so the state data pages are super exciting. It's a chance to take a look at data from multiple agencies in one place. We're starting off with corrections data, and then we'll have jails and law enforcement data on the website. And so that helps with policymakers and the public to see what's happening in a timely fashion, the latest criminal justice data. The other thing it does is it serves as an inventory, and it allows us to pull out a little bit and see what's happening across the country. What data are states reporting, or what are they not reporting? And so in this example, this takes a look at 7 different data points that we'll be looking at for the state data component and seeing how is that data reported, how frequently is it reported, when was it last reported. And what we see here is, not surprisingly, prison population data is reported by almost every state. And in 36 states, that data is reported daily, weekly, or monthly. And then in 12 states that it's reported quarterly or annually, and only 2 states don't report that data. But what we know from talking to corrections directors is that everyone has a daily population count. But that number may or may not be available online. But you can see the prison population data is the data point that's most commonly reported from corrections agencies. But then when you dig in a little bit more, looking at admission or release information, or looking at supervision information, those numbers drop down pretty rapidly. Now, this is a work in progress, so these numbers change every day as we're still in the process of gathering data. But when we put this slide together, we found that about a third of these data points were reported at least monthly. Only 16% were reported quarterly or annually. And that means 51%, or half the data that could potentially be available, was not reported. And so we're hoping that once this website goes live, that more state agencies will be putting more of their data online. Next slide. Thank you. And so the state data component helps us serve as an inventory of what prison, probation, and parole data points are regularly reported by different agencies, and that will help us think through about the feasibility of the metrics that we're developing. As Sarah mentioned, the National Steering Committee and the 7 issue-specific subcommittees will be working together to identify key metrics that help policymakers understand what's happening in their criminal justice system, as well as make better decisions about policy and budget. And so, to give some guidance to the committees, we had identified 2 types of metrics that the committees will want to be thinking about. First, they're going to want to think about system metrics. Basically, these are the building blocks of data, like what is happening in your system. So these are data on populations, operations, costs, typically in one system, how many people are in jail or prison each month. But then we weren't satisfied with that. We felt like there also needs to be data on performance metrics to understand how well is the system operating. And for that, probably have to do a little bit more math and to compare across different systems. And this is where the steering and subcommittees will be taking a look at identifying metrics to see how well the criminal justice system meets goals such as public safety, equity, fairness, and fiscal management. Okay, next slide, please. So it's a lot of work. We've been doing this for a little over a year now. And as Sarah said, we'll be hoping to wrap up the metrics by the end of this year and then develop some resources for stakeholders and policymakers, have that national campaign and provide technical assistance along with our project partners. We don't want these metrics to be just a report that sits on a shelf, but something that all agencies are using and that policymakers are asking for. At the same time, we're going to continue with the state data component in hopes that more agencies are putting more data available online. Next slide. So now that you've heard a little bit about Justice Counts, we want to hear a little bit more from NASC members. When we were preparing for this presentation, we saw this 2020 survey that identified accessing relevant data is a top issue facing sentencing commissions. And so we're eager to dig in more and learn from some of your colleagues. Next slide, please. And so that's where we'll turn to Kansas to hear a little bit more from the Sentencing Commission about some of the dashboards that they have on their website. Next slide, please. And same from Oregon to hear about the data choices that they've made, why they display the data that they have, and more. Next slide, please. And after they talk, more than happy to answer any questions. With that, thank you, and turn it back to you, Bennett.
Thank you, Sarah and Megan, for the overview of Justice Counts. Now it's actually my pleasure to introduce an old friend and to hopefully introduce what will become a new friend. I'd like to introduce Scott Schultz, the Executive Director of the Kansas Sentencing Commission, and Ken Sonchagrin, the Director of the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. Both Oregon and Kansas have actually done some fantastic work developing their data dashboards, as we just saw. And so we thought it'd be a good idea to hear from two of our NASC colleagues to actually talk a little bit about their dashboards and then allow us the opportunity to ask some actual questions. So Ken and Scott, really the actual first question that we'd like to know is, who are the primary consumers of the information that you display on your dashboards? And I guess Scott, we'll ask you to go first, and then Ken can go second.
Sure, and Bennett, thank you so much. On behalf of the Kansas Sentencing Commission, I am Scott Schultz. I'm the Executive Director. I've been there for about 10 years, and I was previously prosecuted and was in private practice for several years and prosecuted in state and federal court. So the commission is uniquely positioned in Kansas to be able to provide data to our consumers. We are the Criminal Justice Statistical Analysis Center for the state of Kansas. And so as a result of that, we have a dearth of criminal justice data that not only we collect from in our own databases, but we also from our Department of Corrections, as well as the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, we receive a lot of felony sentencing data. And so part of as far as Ben's question is concerned, our audience has been a multitude of individuals or stakeholders. We have in the neighborhood of over 4 million records that we have access to. And coming into this, I realized that it was something that we have all this information. We get ad hoc requests every now and then, but we really needed to find a way to be able to get this information out to the public. And so in terms of our audience, most of that public is could be individuals that are simply interested in criminal justice. We do have some folks that on the academic side that are interested, but mainly those folks are in the legislature that are doing research for potential policy issues, but also we even have them down to the county level in that they're actually wanting to look at what their county is doing versus the adjacent county, or if I need if I need some data to be able to take to my county commissioners, for example, to ask for budget requests or something of that nature. So it runs the gambit in terms of who we actually can reach, and that's exactly what I'm wanting to do, is be able to place those dashboards on our website to allow for anybody that wants to come and look at it to be able to do that, and make sure that, of course, we maintain that. And as we go on, hopefully with the presentation, I'd like to maybe even show a demo of the stuff that we have. But that's the long answer anyway, as far as who we're looking at. We're trying to make it as simple as we can, so no matter who comes on the website, they can be able to access that information down to the county level.
Thank you, Scott. Ken?
Thank you, Bennett. I appreciate you having me today. Greetings from Oregon. I think similar to Kansas, we are here in Oregon are also uniquely situated. We're also the SAC for the state of Oregon. And so we receive arrest data from our state police partners. We have access to all of our court data, Department of Corrections. Then we have some other data that we collect on our own that we put into our dashboards. And so again, similar to what Scott mentioned, we let the dashboard itself oftentimes drive who the audience is going to be, or we kind of look at the need and then we build it from there. So we have 12 different data dashboards that we are currently maintaining right now. Some are very focused toward policymakers or toward maybe county level decision makers. Others, a role that we play here in Oregon is we provide around $100 million of grant funding to counties and other local entities each 2-year cycle. And so sometimes our data dashboards are aimed at those county grantees, so that when they're filing their quarterly reports, or when they are doing their annual or biannual applications, then they have data at their fingertips so that they can actually have a data-driven justification for the programming that they are requesting funding for. But then others, and I think what we've done more recently, are actually aimed at the public at large. So a program that we initiated when I joined up with the commission around 3.5 years ago was an effort to collect discretionary traffic and pedestrian stop data from every law enforcement agency across the state. And so we have data dashboards at the moment for 54 agencies. We'll soon have over 160 in our database by the end of this year. And that, policymakers look at those data dashboards, but those are really what I try to tout to local city councils, human rights councils or groups, and then citizens who inquire about their agencies. It has 3 different subsections that local folks can go through and look at to get a more dialed in view compared to some of the reports that we make. And so for us, it really depends on what the dashboard is, and we try to build it, and select data and visualizations with that audience in mind when we're rolling those out.
Thank you, Ken. As both Ken and Scott, as you referenced, your ongoing work, I guess one of the questions that we'd want to know is kind of as a group of national sentencing commissions is what information do you choose specifically to target in your dashboards? And what are there any specific reasons you chose to target certain information or not to target other pieces of information as well? So Scott?
Yeah, so we kind of started basic and just as to what kind of data do we put out, for example, previously in hard copy form. We do an annual report surprisingly every year. But that was a joke. But so we wanted to kind of look at, okay, let's pull some data from there that as far as trend analysis is concerned as to what are we getting most most frequently, or what are the recurring issues that come up on a regular basis, and let's make that into a dashboard so we can make that that information available 24/7. Many of the things we do prison population projections, as do many of you. And again, that's a great opportunity to be able to put years worth of projections on the dashboards, so that you can actually go back and look through at your convenience, and slice and dice any way you want to with the way that the dashboards are actually set up. One of our major, as I'm sure it is again with most jurisdictions, we decided to look at specific areas of our sentencing to kind of tease those things out. One of those things that is a glaring light for us is that of drugs, and so we did a dedicated drug dashboard, and that again teases out all of the separate types of drugs. We usually collect at least the top 5 drugs and you can look at it then in detail on regional as well as statewide, county level, as to what those jurisdictions that you're looking at are experiencing throughout the state. We have 105 counties, and so there's plenty of drugs to go around, unfortunately. But so some of the other things too, we look at probation violations, as those make up a major percentage, as many of our jurisdictions do, of revocations to and make up a high percentage of our prison populations. Those are the type of things that just naturally were conversation starters on, hey, let's make a dashboard on this. Hey, let's make a dashboard on this. We look to and I will say Ken was unbelievably accommodating. We actually, when we went through this process with asking for funds from BJS, this was something that Oregon already had in place. He and his office were very accommodating in assisting us in determining what we needed hardware, what we needed in licensing. We decided to go with the Tableau software, and so that's what we've licensed to utilize that. And would ask, would certainly encourage you to go out to our website and check those things out. Very powerful data visualization software. There's certainly other items or other vendors out there, but that is those are the type of things that we already had them in place. But this was actually an even better way for us to be able to show. And again, the nice part about it, as I indicated before, is you can slice and dice a lot of this information that you can't do on a hard copy that we send out. And so some of those answers that people had before, they could actually get them because of the dashboards.
Thank you, Scott. Ken, I'd imagine with 160 dashboards, you target virtually every piece of information. But if you can kind of discuss I guess, since you collect so much, is there a priority list that you had, or you can kind of give us your approach into, since you have access to so much, if you don't mind, kind of give us your approach to how you chose to get to 160 rather than 20, rather than 30.
Well, luckily we don't have 160. That was 160 law enforcement agencies. We have 12, but I think that when you look at the different breakdowns of each of our dashboards, we probably have upwards of 30 separate pages. And I will say that's a process, that has grown throughout the years. And so, we started with just a few, and we've been adding more, and it's come to the point to where we have many bills that come out of the legislature will explicitly require publicly available, updated data. And so we know that that's their code for a dashboard. And so part of it is that now that we're in the business, folks like to see these to be built and like to consume them. But I think also back to the original question, I think that what data you put up is always an iterative process. Our need for dashboards extends back to around 2013 when my predecessor, who many of you know, Mike Schmidt, he used to drive around the state in his Prius with a slide deck of around 300 to 400 slides on a flash drive so that he could have every combination of prison usage and community corrections usage for every county that he would visit. And so the genesis of our dashboards is really trying to have something that was much more accessible. And so when we originally contracted with Tableau, those were the first dashboards that we built. And then I think we've seen, the amount of data that we put out there, it increases and decreases over time, because I think that, like you were alluding to, when you have as many dashboards as we have, and you have as many ways to slice and dice the data, sometimes on our end, especially from a researcher's mind, we want to slice and dice down so deep and to capture all the nuance that sometimes that can make it difficult for the consumer of the data to figure out what the main takeaway is. And so whether it's through looking at different page views through Google Analytics, or whether it's talking to our stakeholders, which we regularly do as far as the consumers of that data, we try to make sure that we know what they're looking for. And then sometimes we'll actually reduce the amount of data that's available on the dashboard simply because we know folks are not using it, because we don't want them to get lost, for what is the most important piece. That's one thing we've tried to do in recent years, which is streamline our data dashboards to be single pages as opposed to multiple pages, so that while some of the bells and whistles may be taken away, they weren't ones that were especially missed. But finding that sweet spot can be very difficult, because a lot of what we're doing, and I think that everybody knows that, across all the different sentencing commissions, it's very nuanced what is going on in each state. But sometimes we want to make sure we don't lose the main idea for the nuance.
Thank you. And then I just had one kind of final question on that, is that whether you have kind of like the Ferrari of dashboards, Oregon, or whether you have what might be the VW bug of dashboards, which might be Alabama. I guess one of the other questions a lot of us would want to know is how often is that information updated that really feeds into your respective dashboards? So Scott?
For us, it's for the most part annually. We just run off of, as many of you do, fiscal years. And so I am limited as far as staff is concerned to be able to continually update those things on a even, ideally it'd be great to have a real-time basis or something of that nature. Some of those data sources that we're getting only report out semi-annually, for example. And so there's no way that we could go quarterly or monthly or something of that nature. So many of those things that we currently have, and they may change in the future, but for as of right now, we're looking at an annual update that then allows the folks to see that. And otherwise, again, it comes down to a resource issue. If you have somebody dedicated to that, as some do, then you probably will be able to update a little bit more frequent.
Ken?
Yeah, so for us, it also, again, it depends on the dashboard. We have some that are updated annually, some that have laid dormant for a little bit longer because maybe it was data that was very difficult to collect and we didn't have a plan to collect follow-up data. Again, I'm glad that Scott mentioned the resource issue. So sometimes resource can limit gaining access to difficult to find data for a second time. But then as far as resources, we do have a mid-level researcher whose entire job has been devoted to dashboard development, maintenance, and data refresh. But we do have a number of our dashboards that we refresh at least monthly. So the ones that I mentioned for our grantees, as they want to track their prison usage and other trends, those will be updated monthly as we get new data from our Department of Corrections. We do, and so a lot of it too will follow maybe the rhythm of some of the reports that we release. And so we release recidivism reports twice a year, and we update the data dashboards twice a year for those. But then others are updated every 2 years. And so we have a dashboard that visualizes where all of our grant money goes broken down by county. But since that doesn't change between the 2-year cycles, we just do it biannually there. So it's really, again, driven kind of by the research question and by the data dashboard itself. But certainly the resource that goes into updating all those dashboards, it does require a significant amount, and it's amazing how quickly the dashboards kind of become a little stale. And so I'd say that we're trying to reinvent those every couple of years, even if it's kind of a soft relaunch of a dashboard, not a complete tear down and rebuild. But there's always something to fix, and there's always something to update.
Thank you, Scott and Ken. At this point, since we have the great fortune to have the staff from CSG, we also have Scott and Ken here. If there are any participants that have any questions, we'd encourage you to use the raise your hand feature in the screen below. And if anyone has any questions, I think now would be a good time to really ask these questions. And while everyone's thinking about the questions, I think, being on this effort, I think, this is really the ultimate trying to get apples to apples data effort, right? That's something that we all struggle with as sentencing commissions. Everyone wants to compare Kansas to Alabama or Oregon to Kansas, everyone to everyone. And I really think at the core of this Justice Counts effort is how can we get that information out for public consumption, and how for the first time can we have publicly accessible information where we can compare across states. So I think it's a very noble effort, and I think it's obviously going to take a lot of work, but I think, especially seeing the work that you put in on your dashboards, I mean, it's possible, and I think we're definitely going to have some help getting there.
Bennett, this is Carl. I wanted to chime in with a question for the audience, and I'm going to encourage people. Holly just did a chat thing, and I'm going to encourage people to use the chat for this particular function. As you know, I pinpointed or pointed out the Oregon and the Kansas dashboards as good examples for people to dip into, and I looked around and didn't see very many other examples of sentencing commissions running data dashboards. But I wanted to ask our audience if to chime in on the chat function or chime in orally if you want. Tell us if you have a data dashboard, and maybe even send a link to that dashboard on the chat.
Bennett and Carol, there's a question from Travis McIntyre. He raised his hand, so if you would like to go ahead and ask the question.
Travis?
Hi, I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt Carl's question because I thought that was good as well. But my name is Travis McIntyre. I'm with the Pew Charitable Trust, and I was just wondering if somebody could share an example. Like I heard Ken talk about how the legislator and maybe Scott, I think maybe talked about how some city councilors even use their data to make decisions. I was wondering if they could give an example, perhaps, where decision makers actually use the data to push through reforms, and maybe even if they could explain the dynamic of how that was used to counteract some of the opposition to something like that. I'd love to hear about it.
Scott or Ken?
Yeah, sure. Do we have, is it set up so I can share my screen?
You should be able to, Scott.
Okay. Can you all see that? Okay, so Travis, to your question, I'm just going to kind of go into the ones like our drug cases, for example. This gives you an idea of our drug dashboard. Again, we have 105 Kansas counties that we have. And then all of the other metrics that are set up in here are specifically keyed to, in this particular case, since we haven't clicked on anything, the entire statewide breakdown as far as our drug, the drugs that we have as far as felony sentencing is concerned. And as you can see, we have not, being in the Midwest, we have are somewhat insulated from the opioid at this juncture. We're getting there, obviously, but meth is by and large the biggest factor. And in fact, last year it was 70% of our cases, drug cases. But so what that actually then allows for is, let me get this back up here. This allows then for me to dig down. Say I'm a county commissioner and I'm wanted, for example, I'm a county attorney and I'm wanting to show that the surrounding counties are getting more crime as well as I am, and therefore that necessitates an increase in my budget, or I need a new assistant county attorney. We can go here, for example, in Reno County, which is Hutchinson, or I can even go into my county that we're in Topeka, for example. This will then break down the number of cases over that period of time, and then break down even further the drug cases, even through possessions versus distributions, and then even the severity levels of the crimes. So I can now be able to tell them, here's what kind of issues, if I'm not keeping my own records, I can now be able to show them, even taking a snapshot of this dashboard, just exactly a percentage of cases over time. So if I'm say look in the last 5 years, we've had a X percentage of increase in these type of drug crimes. So it does then allow for trends to be developed, so then you could potentially go in and show to your county commissioners that this is becoming more of a problem. Part of again, our whole point of the data visualization has been to be able to show that. One of the things that I became interested in back in 2018 when we did this, Travis, was I was at a National Association of Justice Information Systems meeting. I think it was in Boulder at the time, and somebody had mentioned data visualization, which I didn't know anything too much about at that time. So I started digging a little bit. You can go on YouTube, and there is a Swedish scientist named Hans Rosling that did a TED Talk. It was actually back in, I think, 2007 or something, but he actually used data visualization over a 30-year time period to show public health. He was a professor of public health, and he used 30 years worth of data to show the relationship between income and life expectancy, and it's fascinating. He puts it into it actually, he runs it, and it actually runs through each of the years. And with these visualizations, you can actually do that. And it was just fantastic to actually look at what was happening during that time, that 30-year time period. And he actually stepped through certain things that were happening in the world at the time that reflected those changes in income and life expectancy. And so our main thing here is this actually will tell a story, and most people enjoy listening to stories and storytelling more so than actually just looking at numbers. And so that's been the impetus for if you show somebody that, certainly many people can learn better seeing it visually, but it also helps you in terms of if you are truly interested in data-driven procedures or policies, this is a great way to ram those things home, simply put.
Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Bennett. So without talking about a very similar topic, or I guess apologies for it, we have a good example tied to a drug use dashboard as well. It's actually not a dashboard that is on our website at the moment because we revamped it. But prior to 2017, when the defelonization of first-time possession was passed in the Oregon legislature, we were asked to put together a dashboard that kind of, like Scott mentioned, told a story. And so what it would do is you could go tab by tab to click through, and it would ask, or it would answer common questions that folks have about drug use. And so it had, it had a section that allowed you to break down drug use by drug type and by race. And so the story that was really trying to be told at that point was that while there are similar usage rates when broken down by drugs, by race, there are wide racial disparities with regards to being caught up in the criminal justice system. And so as you progress through and saw that usage rates were similar, it then populated with the Oregon data that showed substantial overrepresentation, particularly for our African-American Oregonians. And so that was a data dashboard that, rather than dropping a dry 30-page report on legislators' desks or sending it to them via email, the commission was able to step them through this during the legislative session and then also during other meetings with them. And so part of the credit for that reform was often given to the CJC for that data work that we did, because we told that story so simply. And so the data dashboard we have now is the one that tracks what has happened since then. And so what we really focus on there is the reduction in racial disparities, because that was the main policy focus at the time. Of course, we just passed complete decriminalization essentially in Oregon. So now we have something to completely revamp again once we see what the landscape looks like. But I think that's a good prime example of what a dashboard can do with policymakers, because that was a direct conversation we were having back and forth with legislators and policymakers at that point.
Thank you, Ken. We actually had a submitted question that wanted to know if the panelists could discuss whether they've encountered any really pushback from any entities for reporting their information. And if in fact you did receive pushback, what were the measures that you took to kind of alleviate the concerns, or kind of to actually soothe those concerns over? Scott?
Thanks, Bennett. We haven't really had any pushback. It's all been very positive. What I would say is we kind of greased the skids early on unknowingly. I was very interested early on as to, if we're designated as the criminal justice place for data, why aren't these agencies willing to give us the data? And it seems like it's siloed. We had relationships prior to that with our Department of Corrections and worked, almost on a daily basis with them. But so I was able to actually introduce a bill and legislation that requires individuals, if the Sentencing Commission thinks it's useful data, we can request it. And that kind of, it wasn't exactly something that anybody pushed back on. In fact, it actually has become very helpful in that for folks that are a little apprehensive about sharing that data, even within other state agencies, this gives them cover because there's a statute. And so it actually has been a positive in terms of allowing that flow of data. So, I would just say we really haven't had any pushback. It's actually been very positive.
Ken?
Yeah, I would agree that we've not received a lot of pushback, but I think that is largely tied to the stakeholder work that we do on the front end to ensure that folks know what we're collecting, to try to let them know that we understand, the nuances and the concerns that they have. So, I mean, I think an example of the way that can be successful is, I mentioned we have the discretionary traffic stop data, and certainly the law enforcement agencies providing that data to us were extremely concerned about how we were going to visualize, what we were going to publish. And so it took multiple years of, as we were developing the data collection process, so we actually had time to do it, of working closely with them and showing them what we were going to display and letting them know how we were thinking about that project. It doesn't mean that we don't get agencies or other folks who step forward with concerns quite often, but a lot of times that leads to a conversation as opposed to strong pushback, and so we try to walk that fine line as best we can, but luckily not too much true, nobody's been thrown a fit so far with our data, but we've been able to work with most folks and come to at least a mutual understanding, even if we still disagree on how the data is displayed.
Thank you, Ken. At this point, I'd like to loop back in Megan from the CSG Justice Center.
Yeah, thanks, Bennett. It's a good question, and one that we're still in the early stages with the state data component, where we are starting off with corrections data, since that's where there's a robust amount of data that is already available online. And we've also been working with our partners at the Correctional Leaders Association and the American Probation and Parole Association to work with those agencies and ask them if there's data that that is missing, if there's anything that they would be willing to make available. And so it's an ongoing conversation for sure. And again, this is all voluntary. We're not asking anyone to create new reports, collect new data. It's just, if you already have a report, are you willing to share it or put it online? One thing that we found in some of our work through other projects is that state agencies might be collecting, analyzing a lot more data than is reported online. And so when we were talking with an agency head in one state, they're like, yeah, we have like 40 other reports that just don't make it online. And it's just the way we do things, haven't really given a thought recently about why that data is or isn't available. And so it's more to spark a conversation and to get folks thinking about some of these data points that could be really helpful for policymakers to have a sense as to what's going on in their system. So definitely a worthy conversation for sure.
Thank you, Megan.
Hey, Bennett.
Yes.
I wanted to circle back to Travis's question, or at least what it made me think of. And I think it's a great question. How does this all kind of apply to policymaker questions? And Scott's response got me thinking about our work in Kansas and working with Scott and seeing how well their sentencing guidelines define dispositions. And as a corollary of that, how good the data is that describes what the dispositions are. So something that I always want to know about a new state that I'm working in, about their sentencing system, is what proportion of people who are sentenced get sentenced to probation versus prison, maybe versus jail. What's that sort of basic breakdown in your sentencing system? And in Kansas, it is an admirable 70% of people getting probation. I think it's 75% in Minnesota, but nearly every single one of those people gets some jail time also. But it's just, to me, that's like a fundamental question about how a sentencing system works. And to Travis's question, what I was thinking about was knowing that sort of strong fact allowed us or encouraged us to over and over again suggest to policymakers, this means that you need to make sure your supervision system is really well resourced and strong, because you are depending on that supervision system for your public safety. Basically 70% of felony dispositions are going to supervision, and you need to make sure that system works really well. And so for me, that was just a really good example, both in Kansas, of what one can make of one of these key data points. And also I wanted to just raise that as my idea for what the NASC crowd might view as a central metric of sentencing systems, and maybe start the conversation about what some other central metrics are, or whether people disagree with that one as a key point.
Thank you, Carl. Well, and I think one of the things, I'll just speak for just myself, I think being a part of NASC, I think it's incredibly helpful to have that peer-to-peer colleagues, that research. I think for all of us that have had an effort like CSG to come in, one of the things we end up discussing a lot is just definitions, right? Are we talking what's a revocation versus sanction? How is a sanction in Kansas a revocation in Alabama, really vice versa? As you mentioned, in Minnesota, a lot of people get probation, but there's jail time attached to that. So is that disposition a jail disposition? Is it a probation disposition? Is it probation plus? So I think an effort like this can kind of spur a little bit more of a robust conversation, even in our individual jurisdictions, about how we define things and ultimately how that information is put out for public consumption. And so I really kind of, like this effort, because it forces all of us to think, because I think so many of us are used to defining information for our own local consumption, if I know it's going to go to Scott, I know I'm going to have to put a little bit more of a descriptor on what really that means. And so I really like this effort to help all of us do a better job explaining. So if Ken picks up some Alabama information, Ken won't have to do 48 hours of research to figure out what prison means. So I think, Carl, I think all this kind of goes exactly hand in hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to tie into that too, guys, from a policy standpoint, I don't know how many times, in legislative committees, I have asked, because we introduce bills in addition to supporting legislative efforts, but they've asked, well, what are other states doing? Well, this would be a fantastic, the ability to be able to present this in that fashion, no matter how, what kind of detailed question it is, you'd have that available to you.
Ken, do you have any, do you have anything you want to add to that in terms of, I'm sure it happens to you too. They'll ask, what really does Washington do? What does California do?
Well, nobody in Oregon wants to know what California does, but yes, definitely Washington and other peer states. We oftentimes get those questions, and so yeah, I completely agree. We've been working on pretrial reform this session, which is a bill that that our agency was asked to introduce, and that is certainly a major question that we get. And comparing definitions and constitutions and everything else can be very difficult. And so yes, it's something we're very familiar with, but we've also struggled to overcome that at times. That's for sure.
Hey, Bennett, I know we're short on time here, but I just wanted to kind of, for those that are interested anyway, we haven't really talked about, and Ken could probably speak to it as well, but as far as cost is concerned, how much does it cost to get something like this up and going? We started out with a request to BJS for $75,000 for hardware, for the Tableau licensing, for training, for those type of things. The BJS has done this for, in many other instances, several times. And so we ended up, by the time we got done, and again, kudos to Ken and his staff for consulting with us about saying, no, you don't need this. No, you don't need that. Here's what we've got. We put it on the Tableau Public, and it's all good. And we got it down to $43,000, and that was with a couple new computers, the licensing, and then we did training in 2 separate locations off-site. Had some training on-site to help us get some of the dashboards set up, and that was basically the BJS was a 1-year grant that we received that was for the $43,000, and that covered, and we can handle the licensing going forward as far as the sustainability situation.
Yeah, that's a great point. The startup costs can be a little bit of a mountain to overcome, but then the maintenance after that is not too bad. A lot of it is, it's probably a conversation we don't have a lot of time for this afternoon or this afternoon, wherever you live, I guess. And because it may depend on restrictions in your data and where it can live, whether it needs to, whether you can use Tableau Public, which is much cheaper than getting a server option, which then means you have to buy a lot of extra hardware too. And so I would encourage folks, reach out to us in Oregon. We'd be happy to talk through that with you, or I know that Scott feels the same way in Kansas to talk through some of those decisions. But the other thing I would just mention is that because we have this history of having dashboards, a lot of folks come to us within the state as well who want to do data visualizations. And I think going back to Bennett's original analogy, with different types of cars, Ferraris or what have you, most folks, when they come in, they have in mind the Cadillac that they want to drive off the lot. But I think that most of them don't even know how to ride a bicycle yet. And so what I would just say is to take it slow and to remember that it's an iterative process and that you're not going to be able to build the most beautiful thing the very first time around, because I've seen a lot of agencies, at least here in Oregon, fail to implement data dashboards because when they couldn't do exactly what they wanted and they couldn't get somebody who was trained off the street to do it, to make that Cadillac the first time around, it didn't end up happening. And so it's just to make sure that you have reasonable expectations, but because it'll come after that. The last thing I'll say is when we first started, our analyst who has built our dashboards for 5 years had never used Tableau Public before or Tableau at all. And so the first visualization she made were extremely basic, and they've grown up over the years to what we have now.
Thank you. Carl, Megan, or Sarah, would in fact you'd like to close us out with any parting words or instructions for us?
Well, I was excited to see that we are producing with Megan and Sarah's slides. I didn't realize how far along the Justice Counts project was, even though it's in my organization. And I'm excited about the data dashboards that we're going to start seeing for people like us in this business who spend our time thinking about all these different states. Having that sort of information at our fingertips is going to be invaluable. So I'm excited about it. And I hope some other sentencing commissions are provoked to think about what the key metrics are in sentencing and to think about having a data dashboard of their own. I think it's a really cool feature and something that more commissions may be expected to do, frankly.
Yeah, likewise, just want to thank everyone for the time. And Ken and Scott, it was really helpful to hear about you taking these ideas and putting it into practice. And one thing with Justice Counts that we're thinking about is not just the metrics, not just the dashboard, but where there are templates or state examples where folks are doing things well that we can point to and say, hey, look at them, they've done this, it's possible. So really excited to see what you've done and to echo Carl's sentiments. If anyone has other thoughts that they want to share after this, we're certainly welcome them and interested to hear what others are thinking and what they're doing. So thanks again for the time today.
Thank you, everyone, for actually joining us. So Scott and Ken, I imagine, so we can just go to your websites, correct? Give us a thumbs up. Can we go to your websites to access these data dashboards if we are so interested? All right, well, thank you. Thank you to the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State. Thank you on behalf of CSG. Thank you, NASC. And we're really looking forward to more of these instructional opportunities as we move forward.
Thanks, Bennett.
Thank you, everyone.